tall ridgeline extending to a peak drives a limestone wedge, geographically, between the city of Mardin and the monastery of Deir Zafaran. The ridge is part of the ragged westernmost fringe of a sprawling plateau known as Tur Abdin. To the south, the flat and fertile basin of Mesopotamia extends like a sea. Upon that ridgeline, above Mardin and the ancient monastery, both is the ruins of a community built into natural caves, hewn into the living rock, and built upon those original dwellings. The language of the people who once lived there, the language still spoken in the monastery below, is neither Turkish nor Kurdish nor the region's distinctive Arabic dialect. This language refers to itself as Suryoyo. I'm hoping, I've written this in the understanding that this is an unfamiliar topic. If it is familiar for you, I'm very sorry. At the time of Jesus' birth, Suryoyo was simply a regional dialect of the Aramaic language, specifically of the region around the cities of Antioch and Edessa. Some art history from the tradition. Aramaic was an international lingua franca, a different regional dialect of which would have been Jesus' mother tongue. Aramaic was a language of successive empires, but not the child of one. Imperial Aramaic was used by Persians, who borrowed it from the Chaldeans of Babylon, who borrowed it from the Assyrians of Nineveh, which is now Mosul, who finally had taken it from the people who gave it its name, the Aramaeans, a people of many small city-states and independent pasture tribes, but neither empire nor significant outward impact as such. When Messianic Jewish followers of the Rabbi Jesus fled Jerusalem's destruction by the Romans, they gravitated towards Antioch and Edessa to the north and translated their sacred texts into the dialect of those cities. The dialect spread with the young Christianity across Asia and all the way to India and China. Genghis Khan was raised by a Christian mother in the Suryoyo tradition. There are around 3 million Christians in India today who are a direct product of that first religious emanation from Antioch and Edessa. This is arguably the largest concentrated population in the world that still uses Suryoyo on a daily basis. Arguably. Today's Middle East remains the home of at least 7 different Christian churches with Suryoyo as their liturgical foundation. But that Suryoyo, which we can also call either Syriac, this is a relatively modern English innovation, or Ktobonoyo, is the Syriac for, in the sense of classical, it has no born speakers. Now, a boy in Tur Abdin, remember the plateau near the monastery, might be raised speaking Turoyo today, a cousin Aramaic dialect, not descended from Suryoyo, but quite closely related, and be educated in the monastery school of Deir Zafaran, learning to read the poets of the Ktobonoyo language and even to speak it conversationally. Conversational textbooks exist. Note this textbook's very clear harking back to Assyrian Chaldean sources, alongside centuries plus old revival efforts. Now, this boy would learn in those textbooks and from his Tur Abdin teacher that he once belonged to the Assyrian nation, that he is ethnically descended from the ancient Assyrians who once ruled this very land he lives on, and whose traditions and artistic and material heritage can still be seen in everything from his favorite food to the monastery architecture, but his family moves to Sweden. His aunt there informs him that a belief in Assyrian descent is nonsense. An obsession with modern nationalism has confounded the true Syrian Orthodox faithful, church, causing them to lose their way in God and seek comfort in the myth of a descent from a supposedly glorious pre-Christian empire of pagans. We are in fact descended from the Aramaeans. But the boy and his father have become convinced of the Assyrian line and lineage. They wind up friends with a nearby family, immigrants from Iraq, who are very faithful Christians, albeit what was in the past called Nestorians, a name the boy learns is now the Assyrian Church of the East. In that Assyrian Mass, Ktobonoyo is used, but in the family's home, that Iraqi family speaks yet another version of Aramaic the boy can't understand. So my question to you is this. The boy, his father and uncle, or father and aunt, his new friends, to which nation do they, or do any one of them, belong? Or, to rephrase that, which nations exist or even might be understood to exist, practically speaking, to which they might belong. Now, it is my contention that the Suryoyo tradition represents a perfect case study of how the nation can be an unworkable framework for the way we approach human identity. And, interestingly, suggests almost without trying an alternate framework. Tipped my hand a little bit, I'm going to back up now. The trend in the last 150 years or so has been towards a centralization, a concentration of the various aspects of identity markers across the Suryoyo tradition. This concentration has from the very beginning explicitly been tied up with and justified by attempts to create or awaken the nation. Very 19th century, par for the course. It was always understood that there would be not just awakening involved, but uniting. One of the most important examples, the man whose handwriting is seen here, Naum Faik, one of the earliest and most important nationalist Suryoyo thinkers, born Diyarbakir, modern Kurdistani Turkey, in 1868. Huyodo, or unity, is a constant theme for him alongside awakening, serving as the name for his longest-lasting journal, which still publishes today. He calls his nation Assyrian, but also includes references in poems and texts to Assyrians, Chaldeans, Aramaeans, in context that could be read either referring to the ancient nations or to the colloquial names of the splintered Suryoyo tradition churches. In any event, they all need to, according to him, unite for the good of the nation, which for him is Assyrian. His conception of the nation is very clearly grounded first on the Ktobonoyo language, and second on the religion. Christian, for him, period, distinctions are exactly what need to be united. A reawakening for him means reawakening of the ancient tongue. This much is explicit and foregrounded. But that ancient tongue begins Ktobonoyo. His Assyrianism winds up discrediting and excluding the already centuries-long tradition of literature in Surite, or the so-called literary Neo-Aramaic, or Iraqi Koine today. Well, slightly different. But speakers of that dialect, being more eastern geographically, were also closer to the ancient Assyrian homeland. So just look at that map a little more quickly. Urmia being kind of the alternative literary Neo-Aramaic dialect's homeland. And for that reason, various other reasons, have more consistently carried on this Assyrian national idea and moniker, which today is used as the name of what was used to be called the Nestorian Church, now is known as the Assyrian Church of the East, is also used for a worldwide Assyrian Universal Alliance, a political movement. Meanwhile, many in the tradition have decided for various reasons discussed above that Assyrian identity won't do, preferring instead Syriac or Aramaean. The two titles have received support from the Syrian or Syriac Orthodox Church, have resulted in turn political movements, a Syrian or a Syriac or Universal Alliance, which changed its name in the last few decades to the World Council of Aramaeans. You can see here conflicting national flags. I believe the Assyrian, the blue and white one, was adopted in 71 thereabouts, and I think the Aramaean flag in around 80. I believe both originally by organizations based in Sweden, which has the largest and perhaps the most important, easily the most important Suryoyo community even worldwide at the moment. So, this brings us back to Mardin and to Deir Zafaran, the monastery, which for centuries served as the patriarchal seat of the Syrian Orthodox Church, and to the ancient caves above them. So, this is, I'll go back to that later if that's interesting. This is Deir Zafaran. The cave that was in the first picture is on the ridge above this. Now, I am by training a poet. I am not a scientist first and foremost. I say that only to ask your forgiveness for engaging what is essentially a poetic, symbolic, metaphorical argument rather than a strictly sociological or in any way scientific one. I plead herder vuk niegosh all in taking this liberty. The estates or mansions of France, the country home of England, this is a singular, self-contained, exclusionary thing. The ancient cave homes of Tur Abdin are not. They are in every aspect, at every level, porous, overlapping, communal, multi-purpose, multifunctional. They begin as something natural, the shelter we're provided with by Earth itself, but are built upon, extended from, expanded out of, using that very same material. A single room that started by serving one purpose can evolve in time to serving others for its original family, or becoming the heart of family life for a younger branch of the same, become adopted and absorbed into the space of a neighbor as its original user's age. Many spaces are entirely communal by their nature. Some are semi-private within the sprawling branches of a single-trunked family. Some are sacred and mid-access only to the initiate. This is how our identity works. Some centuries worth of variations of violence have left much of Europe in a position where we can, without much further introspection, assert a nation is a nation, a house is a house. Sometimes it more obviously belongs built on one particular patch of ground. Other times it turns out it has wheels or can be folded up. And we have to expend lots of energy in insisting to, for instance, some dusty Englishmen, well, it is still a house though, even if it moves. That's what we're doing. What I'm saying, actually, and what I believe the Suryoyo tradition proves, is that there might be lots of different kitchens. And I might not use them all, though I might use a couple. And I may never have bothered to use the breakfast nook at all, or the dining room. In fact, the most important part of my life, of how I define myself, might begin and end with my relationship to the kitchen. And if you insist on telling me and my 5 brothers and fellow kitchen aficionados that we must also clearly delineate which living room and bedroom and breakfast nook belongs to us, and in particular relationship to that kitchen, in order to join, for instance, a neighborhood alliance or association, my day-to-day is going to start falling apart. I'm going to force myself into patterns of life and self-conceptions I've never had to before. And it might cause some serious trouble with some of my brothers. Identity ought to be defined in the same way as it is in fact experienced from the person outwards, not imposed or stamped down or bracketed in. Now, I, for some time, trying to understand this community I work with from a poetic perspective, call that organically expanding identity space a betho, a very slight coinage with grammatical abuse from the Aramaic word from home. I personally am a Maronite Catholic by religion. That is my betho. In terms of land, of territory I feel I belong to, I am also Lebanese and Appalachian. Those are my bethos. A language betho of English exists to which I naturally belong as an English speaker. Many bethos contain other bethos within them. The Maronite betho is one smaller space within the much larger betho Christianity, for instance. It's running late, so I'm going to speed a little bit. Renner's conception of the personality principle asks us to choose between pre-bundled package identities. Of course, there are lots of different methodologies we work with today, but still we nevertheless always find ourselves coming back to this understanding, something like prefabricated houses. We need to not only unbundle one part of that, territory, we need to unbundle all the rest. Strangely, for many people continuing in the world today, one can be Arab and Jewish. One can be Arab and Assyrian. One can be Aramaean and Assyrian. Even if this might strike many ideologues of the nation as impossible, paradoxical, mutually exclusive. I can very easily feel that I have fundamental, inherent interests in common both with people asserting and protecting the cultural continuity of an Aramaean identity, for instance, and with people asserting and protecting the cultural continuity of an Assyrian identity. I can use both of those rooms. Aramaic is not a demos or a folk. There is no single shared or agreed upon language and no single ethne as such. Under the wide roof of Christianity, the Syriac churches stretch the furthest possible distance of differentiation. Now, I've brushed past the Syriac faithful in India, and for the sake of time, I've ignored the Mandaean, Muslim, and Jewish Aramaic language traditions altogether, much less the phenomenon of ethnically Aramaean villages in Tur Abdin converted to Islam and to the Arabic language in the relatively recent past. There is no Aramaic or Syriac nation we can speak of. There is no meaningful hope of the splintered, scattered inheritors of our tradition coalescing into one in the usefully near future. There is, at least in the terms that I use, a Betho Syriac. Within it are many, many Bethos. This is not a policy proposal paper. It is an attempt to do what I, as a poet, am most comfortable doing, shifting perceptions, transforming the terms we use to define our world and ourselves. This theoretical Betho Syriac will never constitute a nation which could represent all the various shared communal interests. It is a door to enter in, though, a space, potentially, to begin. I think I'll stop there.
The interesting point for us, for our discussion, is that can we name it? Can we have a taxonomy for this non-nation towards to a nation through religion, culture, different languages, and civil society that are struggling in parallel in different countries as immigrants, because here we have to put a traditional minority in Turkey, Iraq, Syria, living as immigrants for more than one generation, for more than 3 generations in the West. So have multiple layers of different things. So let's open the discussion.
I found it very interesting that it's an anti-dogma for the romantic idea of a nation is defined by a language, which I don't know any other example which is so clear for that. On the other hand, it reminds me to the definition of Benedict Anderson as a nation, as an imagined community. And this is very obvious that there are totally different, but slightly different concepts of the imagined community, which in a way don't fit to all the concepts of personal or whatever autonomy, because there is no unit where you can put it in, because it ranges here even farther than you said. Even the Talmud is written in Aramaic to a certain part, and the vast majority of it. And on the other hand, in the PKK, they have an Aramaic brigade. So it's the farthest range you could imagine.
So again, I'm sorry, this was very rushed, I know, and there's a lot that I'm trying to cram in and aligning lots of ideas. You mentioned the PKK. It's very interesting to watch perspectives on Kurdish topics from within the Syriac tradition worldwide. On the one hand, there is an attempt to act, I'm going to be very careful what I say here, there is an attempt to act within that framework in quote-unquote the homeland. On the other hand, there is a constant stream of revelation, or of reveals, I guess, about what's actually going on, especially from people in the diaspora. I meant to actually double check this before I came up because I thought it would probably come up, but there was very recently, if I remember correctly, and someone who identified as a Syrian archaeologist who found what was very clearly an Assyrian relief in northern Iraq, in autonomous Kurdistan, who was almost immediately arrested by the governing forces. The way this has been interpreted by especially Assyrian activists worldwide is Kurdistani government trying to repress any idea of an Assyrian ethnic relationship to material heritage in the land. By the same token, I think it's very interesting. This is a picture of Mor Gabriel, the monastery you mentioned. The textbook I showed earlier was a textbook that is used in the monastery school in Mor Gabriel. It's a textbook that in many ways it's a history textbook. In many ways it really undergirds this Assyrian identity. At the same time, the religious organization to which Mor Gabriel exists officially, at least in the not distant past, officially supports the Aramaean kind of political entity worldwide. So you have every time that we think we've found something that looks a little clear, oh well, there are people supporting the PKK. Oh well, we see, every time we think we find something, there's almost always a very strong argument exactly to the opposite. And every argument that's made really does come from a certain kind of organic facts on the ground. I mean, there were Aramaeans and there were Assyrians, and the fact of the matter is, there's almost certainly a genetic descent relationship. They didn't go nowhere, but it's very romantic to presume that we can prove a direct relationship from someone living in Nineveh now to ancient Nineveh, or the Phoenicians, for instance, in the Lebanese case, back to down to modern Maronites. Sorry.
I have to let you know that the Kurdish printing authority in the city of Diyarbakir, which is a center of the Kurdish movement in Turkey, and the majority of the populations actually prints books in Aramaic. And not only print books in Aramaic, it also encourages the recognition of the Aramaic tradition within the Kurdish society, and they have been, in the same way as they promote, and I don't want to use the term PKK because the term PKK is nothing to do with this. It has to do with the way that the Kurdish movement perceived itself as a non-territorial organization within Turkey, and they would want to promote the Assyrians, and in particular the Assyrian language in the context of the Turkish society. The second point I want to make to you is that nations is always an invented characteristic, and you can invent nations historically, and sometimes they stick and sometimes they don't stick for immediate relevant reasons. So whether the Assyrians are a nation or not is something that is, first of all, up to them to decide, and secondly, it is a question to do with the particular insertion. In the context of Turkey, for example, they will demand certain collective rights, because those collective rights are also given to other minorities that live in those particular areas in southern Turkey. So in that regard, I think that it's important to understand that, first of all, the term nation is very malleable, and it's historically constructed on the basis of certain types of inventions and interpretations. And the Assyrians also, in general, have a very strong sense of collective identity as to who they are and what they are. And so in that regard, and they distinguish themselves from other Christian communities also, which is very important, and they emphasize the use of the medium of Aramaic as a medium. Now, there are some historians that had said that Aramaic was taught to them by Christian missionaries. Whether or not that is correct, I don't know. And I don't care, basically. It's not important whether they were taught or were not taught Aramaic. The fact is that they use it. And if they use it and it constitutes an element in their identities, well, who were us or anyone else, or the missionaries or the historians to say no, this does not exist. So in that regard, it is possible. Not at the moment, but it is possible that the Assyrians will constitute themselves as a national community. They are in all the Middle Eastern countries where they exist, they have some kind of collective representation. Certainly among the Palestinian National Authority has a representation of Assyrians, and in Lebanon also they have representation.
For instance, on the Kurds, I want to say very, very clearly that I really don't touch that topic. If I'm relating anything about it, I'm really relating what I understand to be the perceptions of various groups and people, which changes immensely within the worldwide Syriac tradition. And what's interesting about that is the way people react to it. And of course, this is going to be, the actual facts on the ground, situation on the ground, is going to change immensely across borders. And depending on which particular party we interact with, it does seem to me, and this is the one thing I'll say personally on the matter, that Kurds in Turkey have done an excellent job of trying to work with other minority groups. That's my personal experience, but that's the only personal experience I have. I know that they were supportive of, I believe, the only to this point mayoral, maybe there have been two now, but mayoral candidates in this region, Mardin. That said, getting to the core issue of nations. Nations are always imagined, okay, and they are very malleable. The issue I take with trying to talk about a nation in this circumstance is that in fact it's a bundle of things. Yes, there are people who've been speaking Aramaic and in fact various different dialects of Aramaic for thousands of years. That's not up for contest. I don't know anybody who would really claim that the Europeans brought this new language to Christians in the Middle East. The question isn't whether anyone just had any particular descent, or whether anyone has been speaking a particular language for any one time, or even has the right particular understanding of their religion or religious tradition or hierarchy. The question is, do any of these things have to be bundled together in one particular way and packaged to the world in one particular way? And there are a number of really interesting researchers who've kind of proven that much more than just an imaginary community, this is a marketing campaign in many ways, not conceived of as such necessarily, but often out of necessity done as such. So if we're critiquing the idea of an Assyrian nation or of an Aramaean nation, what we're critiquing is the idea that these two poles are the only options. That I can't be someone who is Syrian Orthodox belonging to a church which comes from, or that I can't be Maronite and yet understand that I have a particular Aramaean relationship instead of a Phoenician one that many other Maronites have. That I can't be Syrian Orthodox and insist on an Assyrian ethnicity and maybe for whatever reason at the same time write not in Ktobanoyo but in Iraqi Koine. At the moment, we're getting more and more towards a situation where these are trying by various elite groups to bundle themselves and actually to unite everyone under one particular bundle. And that doesn't serve anybody's actual purposes. The real communal interests at stake in every particular area are the communal interests of, for instance, Iraqi Koine as opposed to a pure literary Urmian, as opposed to Ktobanoyo, as opposed to Toroyo, as opposed to Jewish Aramaic, which is incredibly in threat right now. It has been ever since 48. That's a particular set of communal interests, which exists unrelated to the particular set of communal interests associated with the material heritage of the Assyrians, or the material heritage of the various Edessan or Oroshone Aramaean states, for instance. We can't bundle together in the future in a situation that's this complicated and still truly represent and fight for the real communal rights at stake.
Thank you very much. So this ends